get started. So away you go, Samantha.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted you could join us today. My name is Samantha Taylor, and I'm the head of research at iFi Global. Welcome to the first of our now monthly Risk Forum series. There are going to be three streams to the Risk Forum. Geopolitical risk, stroke macro risk is one, and that is what we are covering today. In May, we are turning to climate risk, and then in June, we will be focusing on digital risk. So each quarter, we will be delving into each of these topics on a monthly basis. At the same time as launching our online risk forum, we are expanding the risk coverage in our media. Those of you who are subscribers would have noticed that our weekly is covering risk-related topics in more detail, and that is continuing to grow over the coming weeks. Climate risk will be covered in more detail in our monthly publication, Sustainable Investment Intelligence, and anything to do with risk governance will be included in the NED, which is another of our monthly publications. Anything which has a connection to alternative investment strategies will be in our monthly AIS. Today, Simon Osborne, our CEO, is going to spend a few minutes talking about why we believe macro-stroke geopolitical risk has become considerably more critical to the investment industry. And then we will turn to Dr. Alan Sked, who is Emeritus Professor of International History at the London School of Economics, to get into this subject in more detail and give us all a broader perspective on what is happening than what we are able to get in the media. We plan to leave a decent amount of time for questions, so please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will hopefully be able to answer your questions before we finish at around quarter to the hour. I will now hand you over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Samantha, and welcome to everybody. As always, when we do these things, I'm always delighted and surprised to see how many people we have from such a wide variety of different countries. I know we have a number of people from the States today, of course, at this time of day, but we also have people to the east of us, therefore further advanced into the evening than we are here in the UK. So welcome to you all. As Samantha says, this is the start of our much expanded risk coverage, and there's three streams of it: geopolitics, climate, and digital risk. And every month we're going to be having a forum like this, but also a lot of coverage in our media on those topics as well on a regular basis. Geopolitics is probably, but not necessarily, definitely, because we've got a lot to say about climate risk. We'll leave that for next month. But geopolitics may be the most dangerous risk that we will face over the next few years, in part because the investment industry is ridiculously, in many ways, ill-prepared for what may well be coming, which we'll be getting into in a minute. Samantha, Alan, and myself have at least one thing in common. We've all were at the LSE, and when I was there, I did mainly economics, but government as well. And there were a lot of very bright people who were doing pure economics, were very mathematical. These days, to do pure economics at the LSE, you've not only got to get an A star in your Maths A level, you've almost got to get an A star in your further Maths A level. So some very good people with numbers doing that, and they often go off into the city to do whatever they do. But their knowledge of geopolitics is ridiculously low. You probably can get a better political chat or geopolitical chat with a taxi driver than you can get with one of those people that goes off into the city to be a fund manager. So the the investment industry, almost globally, certainly in London, is ill prepared for perhaps what is coming its way or coming our way over the next few years. So as a result, we are starting the emerging risk tracker. If you can turn over to the first slide, Samantha, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but we're also going to be covering anticipated geopolitical trends and their potential impact on markets. These things can take obviously a long time to filter their way through, and we'll be covering that too. If you could turn over to the next slide, Samantha. The emerging risk tracker is really focusing on what we call over the horizon risk that could impact markets that we think is not properly factored in. Now, there's obviously a lot of coverage of this in the financial media, if not the general media, and we get a lot of investment reports are coming across our desk at IFI Global, but we're deliberately looking at the stuff that we don't think is properly covered in that. So we aren't going to do much, if anything, on the situation between China and Taiwan and what that would mean for microchips, because that is very well covered and there's nothing much we can really add to that. But there are many things we do think are not properly covered that we will be doing in the emerging risk tracker. And I'm going to spend just a second getting into three of those right now. The first one being the fallout of the US dollar's decline. Now, that is covered, of course, in the media all the time, but the implications of that are enormous in many different ways, and that is not necessarily covered in the media or in the financial media in the detail that it perhaps should be. For example, debt levels in the US are at extraordinarily high levels at the moment. Auto loan debt is at record levels, higher than it's ever been. Mortgage debt is at levels last seen on the eve of the 2008 crisis, and credit card debt, ditto, also way up there. So if we get into a situation where the US dollar is in decline, interest rates have to stay up in order to prevent the further decline of the US dollar, which is a very distinct possibility, that is going to have a potentially seriously catastrophic effect upon not just the US economy, but the global economy. And the US dollar's decline has been around for a long time. It just hasn't been written about or talked about very much, at least until Trump became president a couple of months ago. According to the IMF, the dollar was 71% of global central bank reserves in the year 2000. In 2024, before Trump became president, it was down to 58%. Where will it be at the end of this year or the end of next year? Your guess is as good as mine. But let's put it like this. I'm pretty sure it's going to be below the current or recent 58%. And that is, once we get into further decline, that is a potentially dangerous situation because, as we all know, the dollar has been the global reserve currency effectively since the Second World War. And we're in a situation now where the majority of China's cross-border payments are in renminbi. They're not in US dollars anymore. Saudi recently, meaning last year, switched out of just having its oil quoted in petrodollars. It's now quoted in a basket of currencies. Bitcoin is also a potential threat, as are other potential cryptocurrencies too. So even without what's going on in the US with Trump, the dollar has been on a slow and steady decline anyway. And what is happening at the moment is potentially going to accelerate that potentially quite considerably. Second, and we are going to be in our emerging risk tracker looking at all the implications of this, because it's often the things that people don't think about that cause the biggest shocks. EU breakdown with Alan Sked, we're going to get into that in a minute. That's definitely another potential threat. Again, very rarely spoken about, but I think that is a distinct possibility. Alan knows considerable amount about the EU, and as I said, we're going to talk about that in a second. I would just say in passing, before we get into that discussion, there are many different ways of leaving the EU. The way the British did it, which was to have a referendum and then have an ambassador turning up in Brussels with a letter that he submitted to the EU with a request to leave, is one way of doing it. That we may well find in the next few years there are other ways of leaving too. And one of the obvious ways is simply just for countries in Eastern Europe is just to ignore directives or edicts coming out of Brussels. then Brussels might then retaliate with the threat to withhold funds, but then those countries could just simply retaliate to that with a threat not to send any money to Brussels. So you could have a progressive breakdown through that particular mechanism. Thirdly, and again, a subject we're going to get into with Alan in a second, China crisis. Everyone thinks of China as this great exporting manufacturing nation, which is what it is, but is often not particularly well known that its economy has been very dependent upon residential real estate. An extraordinarily high proportion of the Chinese economy has been in that category. 25% of it is supposed to be calculated in residential real estate. Real estate, commercial and residential, has been in the doldrums. It's been actually in a dreadful state for the last few years, with lots of real estate companies effectively bankrupt and over there. The last thing the Chinese need right now is a crisis on tariffs on top of their domestic problems with, and it's not just real estate, but that filters out into other areas too. So there's all sorts of problems in every direction you care to look. Can I have the next slide, please, Samantha? I think the main point, before we get into Alan in a second, the main point I want to make when we talk about geopolitics is that if you look at this, I mean, there's probably no one following this discussion today was investing before the 1970s, probably not before the 80s or the 90s. We've all been throughout our adult lives, or even before, well before, in a situation where when something bad has happened, the obvious thing to do was just to buy on the dip. The market would always go up. Sometimes it would take a little bit longer than at other times. But look at that. Going back into the beginning of the 1970s until now, effectively, it's just basically, broadly speaking, gone up. My proposition to you, ladies and gentlemen, today is that era may very well be over. Because if you were to show the S&P or the Dow Jones pre the Second World War, I don't think it was an S&P 500 before the Second World War, but if you were to show the performance of global stock markets, the Dow Jones in the first half of the 20th century, it would look absolutely nothing like that at all. And it may well be Smoot-Hawley tariffs came in 1930. We had the Great Depression, which ended with the Second World War. I'm not saying we're about to go into a third world war or anything like that, but the situation that we had in the 1930s could be the situation we are entering now. And my proposition to you, again, is that the investment industry is extremely ill prepared for a situation where the markets, broadly speaking, don't just generally go up over a long period of time. And geopolitics, whether we like it or not, are likely to play a much bigger part in the investment process than they have done throughout our entire adult lives. Last slide before we get into Alan, if you don't mind, Samantha. Just to repeat a little bit of what Samantha said at the very beginning, because of what I've just said, we are very considerably expanding our risk coverage. We have a weekly. For those of you who are not subscribers, you may not know that. And that covers all risks, particularly geopolitics. As Samantha says, it's been expanding and will continue to expand. And then we cover the topics on risk in more detail in our respective monthly. So SIAI, Sustainable Investment Intelligence, we do a lot on climate risk and that, as well as other areas of sustainable investing. AIS is Alternative Investment Strategies, and that covers all risks impacting any area of alternative investing. Quick aside, by the way, just saw this morning, I think it was, that the Chinese are looking to stop investing in private equity funds in the US as a result of this tariff war that the Chinese are in with the Americans. So that's the sort of thing that will go into there. And then finally, with the NED, which we've been now publishing for about 14 years, covers all aspects of risk governance in every single way, and what boards in particular can do, or independent fund directors can do, to get on top of this subject, because we, as the NED has said repeatedly over many years, if not decades now, risk in the industry has been very much backward-looking, box-ticking VAR type activity rather than forward-looking stuff, and I think that really has got to change. So on that note, I think we will now move to Alan Sked, who, for his sins, taught me many decades ago, and he has just about survived that. As Samantha said, he's professor, emeritus professor of international history at the LSE. Even though I was in the economics and government department, as I say, he taught me. He has a considerable knowledge of Europe in particular. Actually started a party called UKIP, which he ended up leaving when various people came along, like Nigel Farage, to take it over. But he spent a number of years working with Farage and others in that particular party, and speaks many different languages. And we discussed in our prep call yesterday, has even translated a book from Hungarian into English, as well as in speaking and other European languages on top of that. So, Alan, welcome to our risk forum. Delighted to have you here today. Can I start by asking you, do you agree with the broad sweep of my comments that we are entering potentially a new historical era? It's good to have a historian here to look at a potentially different perspective on these things from those in the markets.
Yes, of course I do. It is astonishing to a historian who has seen a period of post-war prosperity, stability under benign American leadership from about 1945-49 to the present day. America, of course, subsidized her NATO partners, but this was a kind of price she paid for American empire. Europe was almost obsequiously happy to have America lead. Didn't cause very much trouble, and America paid this price in the same way as the British had to pay a price throughout the world to maintain its global empire. Until after 1945, the empire was a loss-making thing, but it gave us a position in the world which meant that we were a leading power, if not the leading power. But America did the same with Europe, and now suddenly, within a few weeks or a month of the Trump presidency, America has torn all of that up, thrown it all away. America is no longer trusted by Europeans or indeed by anybody in the world. Trump has kicked Canada in the teeth. He's kicking his Asian allies in the teeth. He's just imposed a tariff of over 3,000% on solar panels from Cambodia and over 800 or 900% on solar panels from other parts of Southeast Asia. And he wants to apparently take over Canada, take over Greenland. He seems to be following the Putin line on Europe. He wants America to be some kind of empire again, by the looks of it. And he likes the company of strong men. He's about to, he obviously thinks Europe is loathsome, and its leadership is loathsome, its institutions are loathsome. And he wants to really have a partnership with Russia, and he's prepared to let Ukraine go. The latest peace plan that we've seen from the Americans says that Russia should get more or less all the territories conquered plus the Crimea. Ukraine will get a little bit of territory and around the Dnieper and Kherson back. But another part of the plan is that Ukraine will never be able to become a member of NATO. And that if there's a peacekeeping force from Europe put into Ukraine, then America will not back it. It will give it no security guarantees and will give no security guarantees at all for Ukraine after this peace. Meanwhile, he's not asking Putin to accept any kind of 30-day comprehensive ceasefire, which the Ukrainians were forced to accept. And Putin's obviously rejected it, and yet there are no sanctions on Russia. And another part of the plan is that once this peace plan by America is accepted, then all sanctions on Russia are lifted, and there then becomes an energy partnership between Russia and the United States. So Europe has been left more or less to look after itself. America looks as if it's going to withdraw from NATO. It's already withdrawn from NATO's Ukraine Monitoring Commission. The EU Foreign Secretary, Kaya Kallas, when she went to Washington, wasn't received at all by Rubio. And of course, we've seen the remarks made by Vance and others in that Telegram talk where they obviously hated the Europeans. So what used to be allies have now more or less become enemies, including the Europeans, the Canadians, the Asians, and America is left by herself. A joke to many people in the world, but Trump seems to be more interested in a partnership with Russia than anything else. He says he wants a deal with China, but the Chinese, as we can go on to later, don't seem to be interested in that and maybe planning for a war. So
Yeah,
the
I
whole
think,
situation has changed.
yeah. But what do you think the impact will be? Your description of what's going on sounds fair enough, but what do you think the impact will be? Well, let's just say, because there's always a possibility he won't leave, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, he does leave in the year 2028 when he's supposed to leave the presidency. Where would you guess, as we sit here in late April of this year, as you say, 3 months into his return to the presidency, where do you think the world order will be as a result of what's been happening right now?
Well, it's still very unclear because a lot of people say there's a race between Russia, China, and America to see whose economy collapses first. If the American economy collapses, and you were pointing out all the difficulties it faces, if it were to collapse first, of course, there'd be a world slump, a world depression. If the Chinese economy were to collapse, which a lot of Chinese think is going to happen, if that were to happen, then of course there'd probably be a world slump as well. If the Russian economy collapses, well, it doesn't really make all that much difference. It will make a difference to the outcome of the Ukrainian war, which will still be going on. But apart from that, the Russian economy doesn't count for very much. I mean, it's smaller basically than the Dutch economy, so no one's going to worry very much. But the collapse of the Chinese or the American economies, which are possible, means that it's very difficult to say what the outlook will be. Will Trump still be around? If the inflation rises, the debts, the interest rates, mortgage rates rises, if people continue to sell US bonds, if the Chinese are threatening, well, then there's a secret plan in China I can discuss later, whereby all officials in China who have got more than $200,000 invested in the United States have to take it out, otherwise be charged with treason. And the government is thinking of taking out $1 billion of American bonds and also about $2 billion of equities. So if all that were to happen, then of course the American economy would be in dire straits. So in the meantime, Trump seems to be chirpy about a deal with China, but the information I sort of received from China is that they're taking a very different view.
Yeah. And if you, the implications being that, let's say, at least some of what you've just talked about does come to pass, which we don't know yet, of course. I'm going to ask you the question again in a slightly different context. Where would this leave us as we go into the 2030s, assuming, as I say, Trump does leave the White House when he's supposed to be leaving the White House? Do you think we can go back to the status quo ante, the period, let's say, up until the 20th of January this year when Biden was the president, and we can rebuild the Western order in the way that we remember it, if that's the right way of putting it, collaboration between the European countries and the US, and we can let bygones be bygones, the Canadians, the Americans, and Europeans at least become friends again, and this is a temporary nightmare that we can get over? Or is this going to do lasting damage to the global economy? And within 100 years after the 1930s, we're back into something equivalent in the 2030s.
Well, it would be nice to
is
think.
likelier.
Sorry, it would be nice to think we could see it as an interregnum between sort of normal democratic amity between the United States and its allies. But do you think Canada will ever trust the United States again? Do you think the Europeans, after all's been said and done by the Trump administration, will ever trust the Americans again? Do you think the Asians will ever trust the Americans again? And then there's the whole question of Taiwan. Do you think Trump would actually, you don't want to go into it, but I don't think Trump would fight for Taiwan. I think he'd tell the Taiwanese to send the chip companies over to America. And if they didn't do that, he wouldn't give them any defense. I mean, I don't think anyone can trust Trump. I mean, I don't think Trump is all that balanced. And I think the Russians have got some hold over him, and he's obviously some kind of Russian puppet for reasons I can go into later. If he's gone, and he'll have to be dragged kicking and screaming from the White House, if not another assassination or something. He looks as if he's trying to trash the US Constitution, somehow get a third term, which constitutionally looks impossible, but he seems to think it is. And you might end up not with the American economy collapsing, but America itself is so divided and polarized. If there was any attempt to get rid of Trump, certainly if he was assassinated, there could be a civil war in America. But let's not go to that. There could be a civil war in China if the Chinese economy collapses. But I think we're looking the best scenario would be that Trump is voted out, a democratic or alternative leader comes in who patches up relations with Europe, China, and Asia, and we go back to the status quo ante. But what Trump is doing is so radically divisive that that would be an extremely difficult task to pull off.
Yeah. I see questions are coming in, and I'm worried ludicrously. The trouble with doing these things, the time goes flying by. Shall we go to some of the questions? Samantha, do you want to read? I think the first question, in fact, the first question is about recording, so we'll leave that.
Okay.
There's a question I see about what's in the NED on risk governance. Let's leave that perhaps too. And maybe with Alan here, can you read out the one about the EU?
Oh, yes. So someone said, I disagree with you about the EU. It is needed now more than ever.
Yeah, that's not really so much that's more of a statement than a question.
Mm.
And then that gives me an excuse to ask Alan, who knows more about the EU than any sane or sensible person should know about the EU. What do you think is going to happen to the EU over the next few years, leaving China and America aside for a moment?
Oh, well, it has great difficulties as well. I mean, the key problem is Germany. Germany is at the heart of the EU economy, but it's in recession. The latest IMF growth predictions for Germany said it would go down from 0.3% growth this year to zero. And it's been in recession, and it's huge difficulties with its export industries, with cars and what have you. And Germany is more or less in a place where it can hardly, in a difficulty it can hardly get out of, because it's got this political dilemma that the almost neo-Nazi AfD Alternative for Deutschland is now gaining more votes in opinion polls, at least as many, but more in some opinion polls, than the new government coalition that still has to come in and take office. So it has a completely different view of the world from the incoming Chancellor Merz. He wants at long last to give missiles to Ukraine at a time when, America may be pulling out. The AfD is pro-Putin and pro-Russian. And the real trouble is that there isn't a consensus in Europe over practically anything. The population is incensed that the European Union can do nothing about immigration, or has done nothing about immigration, which is still rising. The population knows that the EU has got no economic growth going for it. The latest figure for the EU for the IMF was 0.8% for the coming year. The euro is sinking. It's failed as a single currency. There's no single treasury. There's no single debt market for the euro. Countries have to look after themselves. The European Central Bank is tied in by all sorts of regulations and constitutional limits. It tries to avoid them, but they're there. The German Supreme Court keeps it in check if it moves too far out of line. So they cannot move ahead united. Germany has got a continuing political constitutional crisis. France is almost in the same position. The leading candidate for president in the next election, presidential election in France, has just been stopped from running by the French courts. So how that's going to play out, I don't know. Macron's been a great failure. He promised all sorts of more Europe. He hasn't delivered anything. His internal policy is a mess. There's a huge problem with immigration in France. The country's seething about that. And in the meantime, Macron is a lame duck president. He doesn't have a majority in the French parliament. So France and Germany are in both ways in constitutional political crises. When you look at the north of the EU, the Baltic states and Finland, they're doing well, they're getting decent growth, and they're actually rearming. But if you go down the Danube Valley, from Hungary to Slovenia to Romania to Austria, all these states in the Danube Valley are pro-Putin. And so there's no consensus on what the EU should do geopolitically. And in the meantime, it's an economic basket case. So I can't really see much of a future for the EU. I don't know if it'll go up in one great bang, but as you were suggesting, it might just crumble away.
There's another. I see that moving back out of Europe into the many joys of the US dollar and the United States. Can you read out the question from somebody's written about the US dollar?
Yeah, so someone said there is no realistic alternative to the dollar as the world's reserve currency, so it should survive the Trump presidency.
I'll have a go at this first before Alan has before Alan responds. I don't think I certainly wasn't trying to give the impression that the RMB or the euro or any other currency is going to come along and replace the dollar. That's not the normal way of things in the broad sweep of history. It's not like you have one reserve currency and it's always one reserve currency. Normally, there's various competing currencies depending on how the global economy is at that particular time. What I was saying or implying is the dollar has been, before even Trump came back into the White House, has been in decline as the world's reserve currency. He's doing a number of things that's going to accelerate that. It doesn't mean to say another currency is going to come along and take its place. And we could be in a situation where, in order for the dollar to have it's the reason the United States is running a $36 trillion deficit, public debt, I should say, is because of it's allowed to do it because of the dollar's global status. If it loses that, it's going to have to pay exorbitantly much more in terms of interest rates. That would bankrupt the country quite quickly. And it's not just the federal debt, the state government debt, which is very high. I mentioned auto loans, mortgages, credit cards, etc. The America, more than any other country in the world, interest rates really do matter, even more than the UK or other Anglo-Saxon economies. So if they don't get interest rates down, or indeed, God help us, if they go up, then we can all kiss goodbye to our retirement plans. A very large proportion of global retirement plans are invested in US markets. And that's, I think, a very risky thing. So something I was reading, was it today or yesterday, just very recently, something like 30% of the US equities are based upon 7 or 12 or 9 or whatever it is, very ridiculously small number of stocks. And if those stocks, Apple, etc., if they were involved in reciprocal tariffs and God knows what else, we are all so heavily invested in the US, we could be in big trouble. So it's a very dangerous situation. whether it's because of the dollar decline or counter tariffs or God knows what it would be, we could be in real trouble. Alan, do you want to answer that one as well about the dollar?
Oh, well, I think you said most of what I would say, but when the euro was launched, it was supposed to take over from the dollar as a reserve currency, but it's turned out to be a total failure. It hasn't actually led to any increase in trade between the EU member states. What I think is that there's always gold. I suppose somebody might come up with the idea of going back to the gold standard, but what people would do is probably do what the Saudis are doing, just work with a basket of currencies. But the dollar, as you see, I mean, it's like France. It's got about the same national debt ratio as the French, and the French are on the brink of collapse because of their debt, and the Americans something like 120% now national debt. But people are getting out of America. Trump is scaring everyone. He seems to think he's performing an economic miracle and will transform America into, give it a new golden age, as he says. But the likelihood is more that he'll scare people away. They'll take the money out of America, and the Chinese are planning to do it in a huge scale. Except that could possibly backfire. But in any case, I don't see any. I mean, unless Trump turns out to be a prophet and his policies turn out to be wonderfully successful very quickly, I can't really see the dollar going sort of being saved. I think it'll continue to decline, and interest rates will go up because the federal debt will go up.
Yeah. There is a question. I think I will attempt to answer it because I think I should. There's somebody who is obviously a subscriber is saying there is now a lot in the NED on risk governance, but what more can boards or fund managers realistically do in an unstable geopolitical environment than they are already doing? And the answer to that question is there's something else we've also written about quite a lot in the NED, which is that how boards can be really useful and be more effective. This may be something that boards can get into more, using the experience and the knowledge of the independent directors to add value. There's a lot of people question the value of boards, fund boards, and maybe the forward-looking risk governance is one of the things where they could add more value than in many cases they currently are. But it does come back to the original thrust of this is, are we, and if we are, going into a whole new era, which Alan, I think, is saying that is agreeing with me that we are, is the industry, the fund managers, the people who indeed run risk management inside the fund investment houses, are they prepared for this? I mean, that's probably not your area of expertise, Alan, but you can point out the dangers outside the investment world that's going on. The question is, and as a professor from the London School of Economics, you'll have known a lot of people who did economics. Would you agree with my scathing assessment of their abilities to look at anything other than number crunching?
I mean, I don't understand how you can understand the world only by mathematics. It seems to be quite mad. But then all the economists I ever met at LSE I thought were idiots, but never mind. And that includes some very, very big names. I remember I gave up going to inaugural lectures by the something professor of economics because I just thought, well, this is nonsense, or it's simplistic, or I mean, I could have guessed half of it myself, and I've never done economics. But anyways, that's that. But you say the boards were taken by surprise. The other people were taken surprise with it. Well, of course, have we gone to China?
Yeah.
The other people who was taken by surprise were the Chinese. They had no indication of what was coming from Trump with these huge tariffs. And they were completely shaken by it. Now, according to reports by Chinese communist dissidents, in April this year, not so long ago, just a few weeks ago, Xi summoned all the top officials from all over China to Beijing. And he took them into a room. They weren't allowed to photocopy the document he was going to show them. And they weren't allowed to take notes. But of course, people with photographic memories did always remember what was in it. But this was a plan, a 5-stage plan. This was Xi's reaction to Trump. First of all, it wanted a broad global coalition of trading partners, including Germany, Japan, all sorts of people, to line up with China against Trump. Well, that was never likely to happen. Secondly, it wanted a military alliance with North Korea, Russia, um, Iran to line up against the United States. Well, I can't see Russia or the Iranians or even the North Koreans wanted to take part in the war with China against America, but that was another part of the plan. The economic part of the plan had two parts. First of all Chinese officials with over $200,000 invested in America were to withdraw them back to China or into a neutral bank on the threat of charges of treason if they didn't. Then they were going to take a billion out of, or sell about $1 billion of American bonds. And they were going to take $2 billion out of American equities. Well, that was all. This frightened the Chinese to death. All these people with money in China being told they'd be accused of treason if they didn't take the money out of America and put it back in China, which they all think has got an economy that's crumbling, were absolutely shaken. Far from shoring up Xi's position, it simply undermined it. They thought he was delusional. And then there was a military plan that, in the end, they would have a military war against America, centered first in Taiwan, but also in the South China Sea generally, and push America back to Hawaii and what have you. This scared the wits out of the military. The military are cheering him on because they think some crisis will come and they can overthrow him. And and the other final part of the plan that scared them all was that if the worst came to the worst, to have a Maoist strategy. Meat, vegetables, everything else would be rationed. If necessary, they could go to caves and eat grass. And this was the Maoist background. And of course, given modern China, that didn't appeal to anybody either. So he's got, apart from shoring up his position, he's frightened practically everybody in the party and elsewhere who's got to know about this. But they're not trying to overthrow him yet, because his opposition, there's lots of opposition to him, and there's a purge going on inside the CCP. What they want to do is that when all this goes wrong, and if the economy collapses because there's banking crisis, construction crisis, demographic crisis, millions of people can't get jobs, when it all collapses and goes wrong, they want Xi to take the blame. They don't want to step in and get the blame themselves. If it's going to go catastrophically wrong, they want him to be there, and then they'll overthrow him when it's all very nasty and it's obviously him is to blame. And there's two sets of there's a number of opposition sets. There's the technocrats who want an open-minded modern China, but they've got no power whatsoever. There's what are called the Red Princelings. These are people who are the scions of families who fought the civil war in China with Mao Zedong. And they're split between left and right. The left-wing Red Princelings blame Xi for betraying the legacy of Mao Zedong. The right-wing Red Princelings blame him for betraying the legacy of Deng Xiaoping. So, but they all blame him for the state of China, and they want rid of him, but they want to do it at the right moment. So you've got a situation in China where there's huge opposition inside the party to Xi, but they don't want rid of him yet until the crisis really reaches boiling point, and then they can get rid of him. But by that time, the Chinese economy may have collapsed.
Yeah, but by that time, the Western economy might have collapsed too.
Well, that's true. There's this race whether America or China, the economy collapses first.
Right. Well, sadly, as always with these things, we are rapidly running out of time, if not run out of time. I'm going to ask you my last question. I want to forecast, if I may,
Oh,
Dr. Scared, as to where here we are in late April of the year 2025. Let's say, what are we, 3 years time. Just please give us the Alan Sked forecast of where the world will be. Asia Pacific, since we just touched upon it, United States and Europe in, say, 3 years time, in the year April 2028.
I have no idea. I'm a historian, not a prophet. It's so much easier to be a historian. You can look back. All I can look at is the present indications, the data that are coming out at the present, and give you my interpretation of it. I can't tell you what it's going to be like. I mean, if I said to you just 2 years ago, you had asked me that question, what's it going to be like in 2025? Nobody could have told you what's happening just now. If I'd said to you, well, that an idiot is going to come into the White House, destroy the world system, say he's going to take over Canada, Greenland, and Panama, he's going to ditch the alliance with Europe, and he's going to surrender Ukraine to Russia, you'd have told me I was nuts.
Fair point. I suppose if you asked somebody in July 1914 what was going to happen in the world, you wouldn't be expecting what did actually happen a month later. Yes.
No, John Keynes, before 1914, thought the world was in the most wonderful condition. Everything was going well. It was absolutely the best state that Europe had ever been in. And then, of course, somebody shot an archduke.
Yeah. Well, I think probably that is as good a note. Well, it's probably not as good a note to end on as one could think of, but the shock and horror that the uncertain could be there. Thank you for this ludicrously bearish overview of what's happening in the world, Dr. Sked. Very much appreciated. I'm going to repeat just what I said in my opening comments. We are very much expanding our geopolitical, but also our climate risk coverage and our coverage of digital risk as well, both in our weekly and in those respective monthly publications I mentioned at the beginning. So if you want to get into this in more detail, and our line is, of course, how does this impact the investment industry and what's going to happen to your investment portfolios or the way the industry is run as a result of this. So thank you for joining us today. Have a good afternoon, evening, or wherever it is you have in the world. And hopefully see you the next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.